She's just a wife. Darren laughed loudly at his company's annual holiday party, gesturing dismissively toward me as I stood quietly by the champagne table in my elegant black dress. His colleagues chuckled nervously while I smiled politely, playing the perfect supportive spouse. "Don't worry about her opinions on the merger," he continued. "She wouldn't understand the complexities of corporate finance anyway." The room fell silent as two security guards approached him from behind. "Mr. Darren Mitchell," the lead guard announced, "you're being escorted from the premises. This building is private property." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Darren's face went white as he turned to see me holding up a key card. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'm Taylor Blackwood-Mitchell, CEO of Blackwood Industries, and you're fired." The crystal chandeliers of the 42nd floor cast elegant shadows across the crowded conference room as Blackwood Industries' annual holiday party reached its peak. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the December night. I stood near the champagne fountain, watching my husband of 3 years hold court with his colleagues from the Mergers and Acquisitions Department, completely unaware that he was celebrating in a building I owned. Darren looked handsome in his tailored navy suit, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his confident smile radiating the charm that had first attracted me at Northwestern University 8 years ago. Back then, I was Taylor Blackwood, a business major keeping my family legacy carefully hidden. Tonight, I was Mrs. Taylor Blackwood-Mitchell, and to everyone in this room except 2 people, I was simply Darren's wife, a pretty accessory with no real understanding of the corporate world swirling around me. The irony was almost poetic. Darren worked for the very company my grandfather had built from nothing, the empire my father had expanded across 3 continents before his unexpected death 2 years ago. For the past 18 months, I had been serving as CEO under my maiden name while maintaining the fiction of being just a wife in my personal life. It was a delicate balance that was about to come crashing down. "Taylor, darling, come meet the team," Darren called out, his voice carrying that slightly condescending tone I'd grown to recognize over the past year. He wrapped his arm around my waist as I approached, his grip possessive rather than affectionate. "Everyone, this is my wife, Taylor. She's the one I was telling you about. Keeps me grounded. You know how it is." The group smiled politely. I recognized most of them. Patrick Chen from Corporate Development, Benedict Torres from Legal, Harry Whitfield from International Acquisitions. They had no idea they were looking at their actual boss. Only my assistant Faye and my head of security, Kennedy, knew my true identity in social settings. "So nice to meet you all," I said softly, playing my role perfectly. "Darren speaks about his work constantly at home. It sounds so complex and important." "It really is," Patrick agreed, clearly trying to be kind. The Henderson Industries acquisition alone required months of financial modeling and strategic planning. Nodded as if this was fascinating new information, rather than a deal I had personally approved 3 weeks ago after reviewing Darren's surprisingly mediocre contribution to the proposal. He had been assigned to the team as a junior analyst, though he somehow managed to take credit for insights that had actually come from Benedict's brilliant legal framework. "The thing about corporate finance," Harry began, clearly preparing to mansplain basic concepts to the CEO's wife, "is that it's really about understanding market dynamics and—" "Oh, don't bore her with all that technical stuff," Darren interrupted, with a laugh that made my stomach tighten. "Taylor's more interested in planning dinner parties and redecorating the house. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut. Around us, the conversation had drawn the attention of nearby colleagues, including several senior executives who definitely knew who I was. I caught sight of Thea Morrison, my VP of Strategic Planning, watching from across the room with barely concealed horror. "Actually," I began carefully, "I find business quite fascinating, especially the Henderson deal. Wasn't that primarily focused on expanding into renewable energy markets?" The men looked surprised that I knew even this basic detail. Darren's grip on my waist tightened slightly, a warning I'd learned to recognize. "See, she does pay attention," he said with that same patronizing chuckle. "Though I'm sure the technical aspects would be over her head. The regulatory compliance alone requires years of experience to understand." I had personally spent 6 months navigating those exact regulatory requirements with our legal team, but I smiled sweetly and nodded. "Of course. It sounds incredibly complicated." The conversation continued around me, with Darren gradually positioning himself as more central to various projects than he actually was. I listened to him inflate his role in the Henderson acquisition, claim strategic insights that had come from other team members, and generally present himself as a rising star in the company I had been running since I was 24 years old. "The board is really impressed with my work," he was saying to Benedict. "I wouldn't be surprised if they fast-track me for a senior position, maybe even VP level within the next year or two." This was news to me, considering his last performance review had been decidedly average, but I maintained my expression of proud, devoted wife while internally calculating exactly how much damage his overconfidence was about to cause. The turning point came when Fiona Walsh, our newest board member and family friend, approached the group. She was one of the few people who knew both my professional and personal identities, and I could see the confusion in her eyes as she took in the scene. "Darren," she said carefully, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Fiona Walsh." "Pleasure to meet you," Darren replied, immediately shifting into networking mode. "I'm Darren Mitchell, M&A team, and this is my wife, Taylor." Fiona's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife?" "That's right," Darren said, pulling me closer with obvious pride. "She's just a wife, really. Doesn't get involved in the business side of things. Keeps the home fires burning while I focus on the serious work." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Around us, conversations gradually stopped as people processed what he had just said. Several senior executives turned to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to secondhand embarrassment. "Just a wife," Fiona repeated slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. "Exactly," Darren continued, completely oblivious to the tension he was creating. "Don't worry about her opinions on the merger strategy or anything like that. She wouldn't understand the complexities of corporate finance anyway. Better to leave the thinking to those of us with actual business experience." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Thea reaching for her phone, probably alerting security. Several other executives were backing away slowly, as if anticipating an explosion. I looked around the room, at the company my grandfather had built in the building my family had designed, surrounded by employees whose careers I had personally shaped, and felt something crystalline and cold settle in my chest. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly, my voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the growing crowd of onlookers. "I should definitely leave the thinking to those with actual business experience." That's when I raised my hand, and Kennedy appeared with her security team. The rest, as they say, was about to become company legend. The story of how Darren Mitchell became my husband begins 8 years earlier, in the lecture hall of Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. I was 20 years old, sitting in the back row of Professor Hamilton's advanced corporate strategy class, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, my dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. To my classmates, I was just another business major, studious, quiet, unremarkable. They had no idea that I had been attending board meetings since I was 16, or that I could read a balance sheet faster than most MBA graduates. My grandfather, William Blackwood, had founded Blackwood Industries in 1952 with nothing but a small manufacturing contract and an unshakable belief in American ingenuity. By the time my father, James Blackwood, took over in 1985, the company had grown into a mid-sized industrial conglomerate with operations across the Midwest. But it was my father who transformed Blackwood Industries into a global empire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Under his leadership, we expanded into renewable energy, commercial real estate, and strategic acquisitions that positioned us as a major player in sustainable technology. By 2010, we were valued at over $2 billion, with offices in 12 countries and more than 15,000 employees worldwide. The succession plan had always been clear. I would inherit the company. Not because I was the only child, but because I had earned it. While other teenagers were worrying about prom dates and college applications, I was studying quarterly reports and learning to read market trends. My summers weren't spent at camps or beaches. They were spent in boardrooms, shadowing executives and understanding every aspect of the business I would one day lead. Understanding money is important, my father used to say during our weekly breakfast meetings at his downtown office. But understanding people is everything. Never let them see all your cards, Taylor. Information is power, and power shared is power lost. This philosophy had shaped my approach to college. I deliberately chose Northwestern over Harvard or Wharton, wanting to blend in rather than stand out. I used my mother's maiden name, Taylor Blackwood, instead of the more recognizable Taylor Blackwood-James, and carefully crafted an image of upper-middle-class normalcy. My classmates knew I came from a business family, but assumed it meant my father was a regional manager or small business owner. The strategy worked perfectly until Darren Mitchell walked into my life. He was everything I wasn't: confident, outgoing, effortlessly charming. Where I calculated every word, he spoke with natural ease. Where I observed from the sidelines, he commanded attention from the center of every room. He was tall and athletic, with the kind of easy smile that made people want to be around him. His father owned a successful chain of sporting goods stores throughout Illinois, making him comfortably wealthy, but not extraordinarily so. We were paired together for a semester-long project analyzing merger strategies in the retail sector. I had chosen the topic deliberately. It was something I actually knew quite a bit about, having watched my father execute 3 major acquisitions in the previous year. But I was careful to let Darren take the lead, offering insights that seemed intuitive rather than informed by real experience. "You're really good at this," he said one evening as we worked late in the library, our laptops open among scattered financial documents. Most people don't think about the human element in acquisitions, how employee retention affects long-term value creation. I had learned that particular lesson at age 17, watching my father navigate the delicate integration of a German manufacturing subsidiary. But to Darren, I simply smiled and said, "I guess I'm just good at putting myself in other people's shoes." Our partnership was seamless. Darren brought charisma and presentation skills that I genuinely admired, while I provided analytical depth and strategic thinking that complemented his strengths perfectly. Our project earned the highest grade in the class, and more importantly, it earned us something neither of us had expected: each other. The romance developed gradually, naturally. Study sessions turned into coffee dates, which turned into long walks along Lake Michigan, which turned into something that felt like the real thing. Darren was ambitious but not ruthless, driven but not obsessive. He talked about building something meaningful with his life, about creating value rather than just accumulating wealth. He treated me like an intellectual equal, something I hadn't experienced with other men who were often intimidated by my academic performance. "You're different from other girls," he told me one night as we sat on the pier, watching the city lights reflect off the water. "You actually think about things. You're not just coasting on being pretty." It was meant as a compliment, though I noticed even then the subtle implication that beauty and intelligence were somehow mutually exclusive. But I was 21 and in love, so I chose to focus on the fact that he valued my mind. We graduated together in 2016, both with honors, both with job offers from prestigious consulting firms. Darren accepted a position with McKinsey in their Chicago office, while I turned down Goldman Sachs and Bain to figure out what I really wanted to do. What I really did was begin my transition into leadership at Blackwood Industries, starting as a strategic consultant for our renewable energy division. The deception wasn't malicious, it was protective. My father had always warned me about people who might be attracted to the Blackwood name rather than to me as a person. When you're worth what you're worth, he used to say, everyone wants something. Make sure you know what it is before you give it to them. So I created Taylor Blackwood, the independent consultant who specialized in sustainability and corporate strategy. I rented a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, drove a 3-year-old Honda Accord, and carefully maintained the image of a recent graduate finding her way in the world. Darren knew I came from money. It was impossible to hide entirely, but he assumed it was the kind of family wealth that meant private school and European vacations, not global corporate empires. For 2 years, the arrangement worked beautifully. Darren excelled at McKinsey, earning rapid promotions and glowing reviews. I quietly assumed increasing responsibility at Blackwood Industries, learning the business from the ground up while my father gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations. Our relationship deepened and matured, built on what I believed was genuine mutual respect and affection. We moved in together in 2018, upgrading to a larger apartment that we could theoretically afford on our combined salaries. Darren proposed 6 months later, during a weekend trip to Door County, Wisconsin. The ring was modest but beautiful, a single carat solitaire that he had saved for months to afford. I said yes without hesitation, believing that I had found someone who loved me for who I truly was, not what I represented. The wedding planning revealed the first cracks in our foundation, though I didn't recognize them at the time. Darren had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the guest list, the menu. He wanted something elegant but not ostentatious, he said, something that reflected our values and aspirations. What he meant, I gradually realized, was something that would impress his colleagues and clients without making him feel overshadowed. "Your parents are being very generous," he said one evening as we reviewed catering options, referring to my father's offer to pay for the wedding. "But let's not go overboard. I want people to know we're successful, but not in a way that makes them uncomfortable." I agreed, partly because I valued restraint myself, but partly because I was already beginning to learn that disagreeing with Darren required more energy than I wanted to spend on wedding details. We settled on a beautiful but understated ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden, with 150 guests and a reception that was elegant without being extravagant. My father walked me down the aisle that September afternoon, his arm steady and reassuring. "You sure about this one?" he whispered as we paused at the altar. "Completely," I whispered back, and meant it. I had no way of knowing that within 3 years, the man I was marrying would be calling me just a wife in front of my own employees, in the building my family had owned for over a decade. But on that perfect autumn day, with Darren's eyes shining as he promised to love and honor me for the rest of our lives, the future seemed as bright and limitless as the lake stretching out beyond the garden's borders. The foundation was laid. Everything that followed would be built upon this moment of pure, uncomplicated hope. The first 2 years of our marriage were nothing short of magical. Darren and I moved into a stunning 2-bedroom condo in River North, with floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking the Chicago River, and enough space for both of us to work from home when needed. The mortgage was well within our supposed combined income, though I quietly covered the down payment through what Darren believed was a generous wedding gift from my parents. Our life together felt like a perfectly choreographed dance. Darren would leave for McKinsey each morning at 7:30, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of confidence that made clients trust him with million-dollar decisions. I would wait exactly 15 minutes after his departure before transforming into my other life, changing from yoga pants and a Northwestern sweatshirt into tailored business suits, grabbing my real laptop and phone, and heading to Blackwood Industries to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The dual existence was exhausting but exhilarating. At McKinsey, Darren was making a name for himself as a rising star in their energy sector practice, leading client engagements with renewable energy companies and sustainable technology firms. He had no idea that several of his most successful projects involved companies that were actually Blackwood subsidiaries or joint venture partners. When he came home excited about landing a consulting contract with Meridian Solar, one of our portfolio companies, I celebrated with him as enthusiastically as any proud wife would. They specifically requested me for the engagement, he told me over dinner at our favorite restaurant, Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, where we celebrated all our major milestones. The CEO said she'd heard great things about my work in the renewable space. This could be the project that gets me promoted to principal. I smiled and raised my wine glass, knowing that Patricia Vance, Meridian's CEO, had indeed requested him specifically, because I had mentioned that my husband was particularly talented and might be valuable for their upcoming strategic planning initiative. It was a small manipulation, but one that served both our interests. Darren got the high-profile project he deserved, and I got insight into how McKinsey approached problems that were similar to challenges we faced at Blackwood. Meanwhile, my own responsibilities at the company were expanding rapidly. My father had been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer in late 2019, and while his prognosis was excellent, the diagnosis had prompted conversations about succession planning that we had been avoiding for years. "You're ready," he told me during one of our Sunday morning walks along the lakefront, a tradition we had maintained since I was a child. "You've been ready for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The board knows it, the senior executives know it, and deep down, you know it too." The transition began slowly and carefully. I started attending more external meetings, representing Blackwood at industry conferences and building relationships with other CEOs in our sector. I gradually took over the quarterly earnings calls, the strategic planning sessions, and the major acquisition discussions. By early 2020, I was functioning as CEO in all but title, while my father focused on the board chairman role and long-term vision. The COVID pandemic, strangely enough, made everything easier. With everyone working remotely, I could attend video calls as Taylor Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, while Darren worked from our dining room table, completely unaware that his wife was making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Our home office setup was carefully arranged so that my workspace was invisible from his camera angle, and our schedules rarely overlapped during business hours. Those months were some of the happiest of our marriage. We cooked together, watched movies, took long walks through the empty streets of downtown Chicago, and talked for hours about our dreams and ambitions. Darren was supportive when I told him I was considering starting my own consulting firm, and I was equally encouraging when he shared his goal of making partner at McKinsey before he turned 30. "We're a good team," he said one evening as we sat on our balcony, watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and amber. "We bring out the best in each other." I believed that completely. Despite the deception about my identity, everything else about our relationship felt genuine and healthy. We challenged each other intellectually, supported each other emotionally, and shared a vision of building something meaningful together. When Darren talked about his work, I could offer insights that seemed intuitive, but were actually informed by my experience running a similar type of organization. When I needed to vent about client problems or strategic challenges, he provided thoughtful advice that often proved surprisingly useful. The formal transition of power at Blackwood Industries happened in September 2020, on my 26th birthday. The board vote was unanimous, and the announcement was made quietly during a virtual board meeting that I attended from our guest bedroom while Darren worked client calls from the living room. "Congratulations, Madam CEO," my father said as we celebrated privately over dinner at his penthouse apartment later that evening. "Your grandfather would be so proud." That night, I came home to find Darren waiting with champagne and takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He had remembered that I had mentioned having a big presentation that day for my consulting business, and he wanted to celebrate what he assumed had been a successful client meeting. "To my brilliant wife," he toasted, pulling me close for a kiss that tasted like Dom Perignon and possibility. "Whatever you presented today, I'm sure you knocked it out of the park." If only he had known that what I had presented was my vision for the next 5 years of growth at one of Chicago's largest privately held corporations, and that the client who had approved it was actually a board of directors that now reported to me. The irony was delicious, but it was also becoming complicated. As 2020 turned into 2021, Darren's career continued to accelerate. He was promoted to principal ahead of schedule, landed several major clients, and began to be recognized as one of McKinsey's most promising young partners. His success was genuine and well-deserved, but it was also increasingly built on expertise in industries where Blackwood Industries was a major player. More concerning was the subtle shift I began to notice in how he talked about our respective careers. When we attended business school reunions or social events with other couples, Darren would introduce himself first, then add me as an afterthought. "I'm a principal at McKinsey, focusing on energy and sustainability consulting," he would say. "And this is my wife Taylor. She runs a small consulting practice." The word small stung more than it should have, particularly since Blackwood Industries' annual revenue was roughly equivalent to the GDP of several small countries. But I told myself it was just a reflection of his limited understanding of my actual work, not a deliberate minimization of my achievements. Looking back, I can see that this was when the foundation began to shift beneath us. Success was changing Darren in ways that were too subtle to address, but too significant to ignore. The man who had fallen in love with my intelligence was slowly becoming someone who saw my career as secondary to his own. The partnership that had felt so natural in college was evolving into something more hierarchical, more traditional, more limiting. But in the moment, surrounded by the glow of our shared accomplishments and mutual affection, these changes felt like minor adjustments rather than fundamental shifts. We were still the power couple from Northwestern, still the team that brought out the best in each other, still building toward a future that seemed bright and limitless. The peak was beautiful, while it lasted. From up there, it was impossible to see how far we had to fall. The changes started so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. It began with something as simple as dinner reservations. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Darren had always asked where I wanted to go when we planned date nights. "Your choice, babe," he'd say, genuinely interested in my preferences. But sometime in early 2021, those conversations shifted into announcements. "I made us reservations at a Linnea for Friday," he would say, not asking but informing. When I mentioned that I'd been looking forward to trying the new Italian place in Lincoln Park, he would wave dismissively. "Trust me, Alinea will be much more impressive. I'm meeting with the Henderson Group next week, and Marcus mentioned he loves Grant Acatz's work." It was such a small thing that pointing it out would have seemed petty. But it was the first crack in the foundation, the moment when my preferences became secondary to his networking opportunities. The pattern expanded into other areas so smoothly that I barely noticed it happening. Our weekend plans increasingly revolved around events that would benefit Darren's career: golf tournaments with McKinsey partners, charity galas where he could meet potential clients, dinner parties hosted by other consulting firms. When I suggested we spend a quiet Saturday hiking in Wisconsin or visiting the art museum, Darren would agree but somehow find reasons why we needed to cut the day short. "Sorry, babe, but Benedict Torres just texted about an impromptu networking event at the Union League Club," he would say, already reaching for his phone. "Rain check on the Frank Lloyd Wright exhibit?" The rain checks started accumulating like unpaid debts. What bothered me most wasn't the change in our social calendar. I understood that career advancement required strategic networking. What bothered me was that Darren seemed to assume his career advancement was more important than mine, despite having no real understanding of what my work actually involved. "How was your day?" became a perfunctory question that he asked while scrolling through emails or checking LinkedIn. When I tried to share details about major decisions I was making at Blackwood, carefully disguised as consulting projects, his responses grew increasingly distracted. He would murmur when I mentioned navigating a complex acquisition in renewable battery technology. That sounds challenging. Hey, did I tell you that Patterson Industries wants to expand their consulting relationship with us? Patterson Industries was actually one of our competitors, and I had been in meetings all week discussing strategies to outmaneuver them in the European market. But to Darren, his tangential involvement with them through McKinsey was inherently more significant than my small consulting projects. The most telling incident happened in March 2021, during a virtual happy hour with our Northwestern Business School alumni group. We were both participating from our home office, sitting side by side at our respective laptops. The conversation had turned to career updates, and our classmates were sharing news about promotions, job changes, and professional achievements. "Darren, you're at McKinsey now, right?" asked Sarah Kim, who had been in our corporate strategy class. "How's that going?" Darren launched into an enthusiastic update about his recent promotion to principal and his growing client portfolio in the sustainability sector. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, detailing specific projects and strategic insights with the kind of passion that made everyone lean in closer to their screens. "That's amazing," Sarah responded. "And Taylor, what about you? Are you still in consulting too?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Darren jumped in before I could speak. "Taylor's doing some freelance strategy work," he said with what I was beginning to recognize as his dismissive chuckle. "Nothing as intense as what we deal with at McKinsey, but she's keeping busy." The casual erasure of my actual achievements was breathtaking. In the 6 months since I had officially become CEO of Blackwood Industries, I had overseen 2 major acquisitions, launched a new sustainable technology division, and increased our annual revenue by 12%. But in Darren's narrative, I was keeping busy with freelance projects while he handled the serious business of corporate consulting. Our classmates moved on to other topics, but I sat there feeling strangely invisible despite being literally visible on the screen. It was the first time I truly understood how dismissal could be more painful than direct criticism. Darren hadn't said anything technically wrong. I was indeed doing strategy work, and from his perspective, it probably did seem less intense than McKinsey's high-pressure environment. But his casual minimization of my professional life felt like a preview of something much more troubling. After the call ended, I tried to address it directly. "I felt like you cut me off when Sarah asked about my work," I said, keeping my tone light and curious rather than accusatory. Darren looked genuinely surprised. "Did I? I thought I was being supportive. I mean, your consulting work is going well, right? I just didn't want you to feel pressured to oversell it." Oversell it, as if accurately describing my actual responsibilities would somehow be dishonest or inappropriate. "I can speak for myself about my own career," I said, still trying to maintain the tone of reasonable discussion rather than argument. "Of course you can," Darren agreed quickly, but I caught the slight edge in his voice that suggested he found my sensitivity unreasonable. "I was just trying to help. You know how competitive everyone gets during those calls." The conversation ended there, but something had shifted between us. For the first time in our relationship, I felt like Darren saw me as someone who needed his protection from my own ambitions, rather than as a partner whose achievements complemented his own. The most insidious part was how reasonable his behavior seemed on the surface. He wasn't being overtly controlling or deliberately dismissive. He was being what he probably considered protective and supportive, ensuring that I didn't embarrass myself by overstating my professional importance in front of our high-achieving classmates. But the effect was the same. My voice was being gradually diminished, my achievements minimized, and my professional identity reshaped to fit more comfortably alongside his growing success. I began to notice how often he interrupted me in social situations, not maliciously but reflexively, as if his thoughts were inherently more urgent than mine. I noticed how he introduced me at business events. "This is my wife Taylor," rather than "This is Taylor, my wife." A subtle shift that positioned me as an appendage to his identity, rather than a person with my own professional standing. Most troubling of all, I noticed how I was beginning to adapt to these changes rather than challenge them. It was easier to let Darren take the lead in conversations than to insist on equal speaking time. It was simpler to agree with his restaurant choices than to negotiate for alternatives. It was less complicated to accept his characterization of my work than to correct it in ways that might raise uncomfortable questions about what I actually did for a living. The cracks were small, barely visible, easily explained away as minor adjustments in a healthy relationship. But they were spreading, and I was starting to understand that foundations can crumble gradually before they collapse all at once. By the fall of 2021, what had started as small cracks had evolved into a systematic pattern of diminishment that I was finally beginning to recognize. The changes weren't dramatic enough to confront directly, but they were consistent enough to create a new dynamic in our marriage, one where Darren's voice carried more weight than mine in virtually every situation. The transformation was most evident during social gatherings. At a dinner party hosted by one of Darren's McKinsey colleagues, I watched him hold court with a group of consultants and their spouses, discussing the challenges of sustainable energy policy. It was a topic I knew intimately. Blackwood Industries had just completed a major wind farm acquisition in Iowa, and I had spent weeks in meetings with federal regulators about renewable energy incentives. "The real issue," Darren was saying, "is that most politicians don't understand the economic complexities of transitioning from fossil fuels. They think you can just flip a switch and suddenly have green energy everywhere." I opened my mouth to add a point about grid infrastructure challenges, but Darren continued without pausing. "At McKinsey, we've been working with several major utilities to develop transition strategies that actually make financial sense. It's not just about being environmentally responsible, it has to be economically viable." "That's fascinating," said Caroline Walsh, the wife of one of Darren's partners. "Taylor, do you work in this area too?" Before I could respond, Darren answered for me. "Taylor does some consulting work, but more on the administrative side. She's really good with the organizational stuff, keeping projects on track, managing timelines, that sort of thing." Organizational stuff. I was the CEO of a company that owned 4 wind farms, 2 solar installations, and a cutting-edge battery storage facility. But in Darren's narrative, I helped keep track of schedules. "Actually," I interjected, "I work quite a bit with renewable energy policy." The regulatory environment is incredibly complex, especially when you're dealing with multi-state projects that cross different jurisdictional boundaries. Darren's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Right, but that's more on the compliance side," he said, patting my hand in a gesture that felt patronizing rather than affectionate. "The strategic planning is where things get really complicated." The conversation moved on, but I sat there feeling erased. Not just dismissed, erased. As if my actual expertise had been rewritten into something more palatable, more traditionally feminine, more supportive of Darren's positioning as the serious professional in our marriage. This pattern extended into our personal interactions as well. When we discussed major purchases for our condo, Darren increasingly framed the conversations as him making informed decisions while graciously consulting me for input. We needed a new television, and I had researched models, compared prices, and identified the best option for our space and budget. But when we went to the store, Darren immediately began talking to the salesperson as if he were the primary decision-maker. "We're looking for something in the 65-inch range," he said, completely ignoring the 55-inch model I had selected based on our room dimensions. "Price isn't really the primary concern. We want the best picture quality." When I quietly mentioned, That we had agreed on a smaller size, Darren waved dismissively. Trust me, babe, you'll appreciate the bigger screen once you see it. We left with a television that was too large for our space and cost nearly double what we had budgeted. When I tried to discuss it later, Darren explained that he had experience with these kinds of purchases and knew what would work best. The fact that I had managed technology budgets worth millions of dollars was apparently irrelevant to selecting consumer electronics. The most troubling incident happened during Thanksgiving dinner with my parents. My father had been asking about our careers, and Darren launched into an enthusiastic description of his recent promotion to senior principal at McKinsey. He spoke for 15 minutes about his growing client portfolio, his leadership role in the energy practice, and his prospects for making partner within the next 2 years. That's wonderful, Darren, my mother said warmly. And Taylor, how is your consulting business developing? I began to answer, but Darren interrupted with what had become his standard explanation. Taylor's been focusing more on work-life balance lately, he said with an indulgent smile. She's realized that the high-pressure consulting environment isn't really her thing. She prefers to take on smaller projects that don't require the same level of intensity. My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. They knew exactly what my actual job entailed, but they couldn't contradict Darren's characterization without revealing information I had specifically asked them to keep confidential. I see, my father said carefully. And you're finding that fulfilling? Very much so, I lied. Because what else could I say? That my husband was systematically rewriting my professional identity to make himself feel more important. That the woman he described bore no resemblance to the person who had spent the morning in a video conference with renewable energy executives from 3 different countries. Later that evening, my mother cornered me in the kitchen while Darren was watching football with my father. Are you happy? She asked bluntly, her voice low enough to avoid being overheard. The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I didn't know how to answer it. Was I happy? I loved Darren, or at least I loved the man I had married. But that man seemed to be evolving into someone who needed me to be smaller so that he could feel larger. I'm fine, Mom, I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. You know you don't have to diminish yourself to make someone else comfortable, she said, her words carefully chosen. Your father never asked me to make myself smaller, even when his career was more public than mine. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Because the truth was that Darren had never explicitly asked me to make myself smaller. He had simply created an environment where doing so felt like the path of least resistance, where challenging his characterizations would require conversations I wasn't ready to have. The irony was devastating. I was running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, making decisions that affected thousands of people, and being recognized as one of the most promising young CEOs in the sustainability sector. But in my own marriage, I was becoming invisible. My achievements translated into something more acceptable, more traditionally feminine, more supportive of my husband's narrative about our respective places in the world. That night, as Darren slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I had allowed this to happen. How had the woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated complex acquisitions become someone who couldn't even correct her husband's mischaracterization of her career? The answer was both simple and terrifying. It had happened gradually, one small concession at a time, until I had forgotten what it felt like to take up my full space in the world. The foundation wasn't just cracking anymore. It was actively being undermined, and I was starting to realize that I might be the only one who could stop it. The moment that shattered everything happened on a Tuesday evening in February 2022, during what should have been a celebration. Darren had just been offered a partnership track at McKinsey, the youngest person in the Chicago office to achieve that milestone. I was genuinely proud of him, despite everything else that had been deteriorating between us. His success was real and hard-earned, and I wanted to celebrate it properly. I had made reservations at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, our traditional celebration spot, and arranged for a bottle of his favorite champagne to be waiting at our table. What I hadn't anticipated was that Darren would invite 3 of his McKinsey colleagues to join us without consulting me first. "I hope you don't mind," he said as we walked into the restaurant, and I saw Patrick Chen, Benedict Torres, and Harry Whitfield already seated at what I had assumed would be our intimate table for 2. The guys wanted to celebrate too, and I thought it would be good to include them. I minded, but saying so would have made me look petty and unsupportive. So I smiled and played the role of the gracious wife, congratulating the men on Darren's achievement and listening as they discussed the implications for his career trajectory. "Partnership track at 31, Patrick said, raising his glass. "That's seriously impressive, man. Most people don't make it until their mid-30s at the earliest." "It's all about client development and thought leadership," Darren replied, settling into what I had come to recognize as his holding court mode. "You have to position yourself as more than just a consultant. You have to be a strategic advisor, someone clients see as an extension of their own leadership team." The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with Darren explaining his philosophy of client relationships and the other men asking increasingly detailed questions about his approach to business development. I sat quietly, occasionally, nodding or smiling, feeling more like a decorative accessory than a participant in the conversation. Finally, Benedict turned to me with what seemed like genuine interest. "Taylor, you're in consulting too, right? Do you find the client development aspect as challenging as Darren makes it sound?" It was a perfectly reasonable question, and one that I could have answered with considerable expertise. Building and maintaining client relationships was one of my strongest skills as CEO. I had personally negotiated partnerships with some of the largest corporations in North America and Europe. But before I could respond, Darren jumped in with his now familiar explanation. "Taylor works more on the operational side," he said with that dismissive chuckle that had become his signature response to questions about my career. "She's not really involved in the high-stakes client management that we deal with at places like McKinsey. Her projects are more—" He paused, searching for the right word. "More manageable. Less pressure. Less pressure." I was sitting there, having just spent the afternoon in a conference call with executives from a German automotive company, negotiating the terms of a joint venture worth over $200 million. But in Darren's narrative, I handled manageable projects that didn't require the sophisticated skills needed for real consulting work. "Still," Harry interjected politely, "any insights from the operational perspective would be interesting to hear." I opened my mouth to respond, but Darren continued talking as if Harry hadn't spoken. "The thing about partnership track," he said, "is that it's not just about billable hours anymore. You have to think strategically about practice development, industry positioning, all the macro-level stuff that most consultants never have to consider." And then he said the words that changed everything between us. "It's probably hard for someone like Taylor to understand, but when you're operating at this level, every decision has implications that ripple through the entire organization. You can't just focus on your individual projects anymore. You have to think about how your work affects the broader strategic direction of the firm." Someone like Taylor. As if I were inherently incapable of understanding strategic thinking. As if my gender, my personality, or my supposedly small-scale consulting work had made me fundamentally unable to grasp the complexities of organizational leadership. The silence that followed was deafening. Patrick, Benedict, and Harry all looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that Darren had crossed some invisible line. But what struck me most was that Darren himself seemed completely oblivious to what he had just said. He reached for his wine glass and continued talking about partnership expectations, as if he hadn't just publicly declared his wife intellectually inferior. I excused myself to go to the restroom, not because I needed to use it, but because I needed a moment to process what had just happened. Standing in front of the mirror in the elegant bathroom at Gibson's, I looked at my reflection and finally saw clearly what I had been trying to ignore for months. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. She was well-dressed, well-educated, and well-spoken, but she had somehow allowed herself to become invisible in her own life. She had permitted her husband to reshape her identity into something more palatable, more traditionally feminine, more supportive of his narrative about their respective places in the world. But she was also the CEO of one of Chicago's most successful privately held corporations. She was someone who commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. She was a woman who had been trained from childhood to lead, to make difficult decisions, and to never accept less than what she deserved. The cognitive dissonance was finally too great to ignore. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to other topics, but I could barely focus on what anyone was saying. All I could think about was how many times over the past year Darren had dismissed my capabilities, minimized my achievements, and positioned me as someone who needed his protection from challenges I was actually more qualified to handle than he was. The evening ended with handshakes and congratulations, and Darren and I rode home in relative silence. He seemed energized by the evening, chatting about his career prospects and the opportunities that partnership track would provide. I made appropriate responses, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning in ways that felt familiar from my professional life but foreign in the context of my marriage. "Thanks for tonight," Darren said as we got ready for bed. "I know business dinners aren't always your favorite thing, but it was important to include the team in the celebration." "Of course," I replied automatically, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. That night, as Darren slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake thinking about the woman I had been before I met him, and the woman I had somehow allowed myself to become. The transformation hadn't been intentional or malicious, but it had been complete. I had traded my authentic self for the promise of a harmonious marriage, and the transaction was finally revealing its true cost. The breaking point wasn't dramatic or violent. It was simply the moment when I stopped being willing to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's need to feel larger. The moment when I decided that being loved for who I wasn't was actually worse than not being loved at all. The foundation had finally crumbled completely. Now I had to decide what to build in its place. The morning after the dinner at Gibson's, I woke up with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after a major decision has been made, even if you haven't yet acknowledged it consciously. Darren left for the office at his usual time, kissing me goodbye and mentioning something about a client presentation later that afternoon. I smiled and wished him luck, but internally I was already shifting into a different mode of thinking, one that felt familiar from my professional life, but completely foreign in the context of my marriage. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think strategically about my personal situation, rather than simply reacting to it emotionally. The first thing I needed to understand was exactly how much Darren knew about my real identity and responsibilities. Over the course of our relationship, I had been careful to maintain the fiction that I was an independent consultant working on small-scale projects, but there had been moments when information might have leaked through. Had he ever seen documents with my real title? Had he overheard phone calls that revealed more than I intended? Did he have any suspicion that his wife was actually one of the most powerful people in Chicago's business community? I started by reviewing our shared digital footprint. Our joint bank account showed deposits from Blackwood Consulting Services, the shell company I had created to funnel my CEO salary in a way that appeared consistent with freelance consulting work. The amounts were substantial, but not unreasonably so for someone working with high-end corporate clients. More importantly, there was nothing in our shared financial records that would indicate I was earning CEO-level compensation. Next, I examined our home office setup. I had been scrupulously careful to keep my real work materials separate from anything Darren might accidentally encounter. My actual laptop, phone, and documents were all secured in a locked filing cabinet that Darren had never shown any interest in exploring. As far as he knew, it contained tax records and other boring administrative paperwork. The more I investigated, the more confident I became that Darren truly had no idea who I really was. His dismissive attitude toward my career wasn't based on knowledge he was trying to suppress. It was based on genuine ignorance about what I actually did for a living. In some ways, this made his behavior more insulting rather than less. He was comfortable diminishing me because he truly believed there was nothing significant to diminish. But I also realized that his ignorance might be exactly the advantage I needed. Over the next several days, I began paying closer attention to Darren's work situation and his relationships with colleagues. I had always been peripherally aware of his professional network, but I had never really examined it through the lens of my own corporate position. Now, with my CEO knowledge fully engaged, I started to see connections and opportunities that had been invisible to me as just a wife. McKinsey's Chicago office did significant work with companies in the renewable energy sector, companies that were often competitors, partners, or potential acquisition targets for Blackwood Industries. Darren's expertise in sustainability consulting meant that he was likely working on projects that directly related to my strategic priorities as CEO. More intriguingly, several of his recent clients were companies that I had been watching with interest for potential partnership or acquisition opportunities. This created a fascinating possibility. I could potentially use Darren's professional relationships to advance Blackwood's business interests, all while he remained completely unaware of the connection. It would require careful planning and perfect execution, but the potential benefits were enormous. The idea both thrilled and disturbed me. On one hand, it felt like poetic justice, using the dismissive husband who saw me as strategically irrelevant to actually advance my strategic objectives. On the other hand, it represented a level of manipulation that went far beyond anything I had done before in our relationship. But as I thought about it more, I realized that what I was contemplating wasn't really different from what Darren had been doing to me for months. He had been using our marriage to advance his career, leveraging my emotional support, my social connections, and my intellectual contributions while publicly characterizing me as someone whose opinions didn't matter. The only difference was that I would be doing it more intentionally and with full awareness of what I was accomplishing. I started small, testing the waters during casual conversations about his work. When Darren mentioned that he was working on a project with Meridian Solar, one of our portfolio companies, I asked innocent questions about their strategic challenges and upcoming initiatives. His answers gave me valuable insights into how our subsidiary was being perceived by external consultants, information that I could use to improve their performance and market positioning. "You're really interested in this stuff lately," Darren commented one evening after I had asked several detailed questions about his renewable energy clients. "Maybe you should consider pivoting your consulting practice towards sustainability work." The irony was breathtaking. He was suggesting that I consider entering the exact field where I was already one of the most influential leaders in the country. "That's an interesting idea," I replied carefully. "I'd probably need to learn a lot more about the industry dynamics before I could be competitive in that space." "I could help with that," Darren offered generously. "I know all the key players in the Chicago market, and I have pretty good insights into where the industry is heading." I accepted his offer with appropriate gratitude, while internally marveling at the fact that my husband was volunteering to teach me about an industry where I employed more people than he had ever met. Over the following weeks, Darren began sharing increasingly detailed information about his clients, their strategic challenges, and McKinsey's recommendations for addressing them. He seemed to enjoy positioning himself as my mentor and teacher, explaining complex business concepts that he assumed I had never encountered before. Each conversation provided me with competitive intelligence that was worth millions of dollars. To Blackwood Industries. I learned about upcoming merger discussions, strategic partnerships under consideration, and technology investments that could affect our market position. All while Darren congratulated himself on helping his wife understand the sophisticated world of corporate consulting. The most valuable discovery came during a conversation about Patterson Industries, one of our major competitors in the renewable energy storage market. Darren mentioned casually that McKinsey was helping Patterson develop a strategy for expanding into the European market, exactly the same market where Blackwood was planning our own major expansion. They're looking at a potential acquisition. In Germany, Darren explained over dinner, clearly proud of his insider knowledge. There's a battery technology company in Munich that could give them a significant competitive advantage in the European Union. I nodded thoughtfully, filing away the information while asking follow-up questions that seemed curious rather than strategic. Within 24 hours, I had initiated preliminary discussions with that same German company, leveraging Blackwood's superior financial position to present a more attractive acquisition offer than Patterson could possibly match. By the end of March, I had used information gained through Darren's mentoring sessions to outmaneuver 3 competitors, identify 2 potential acquisition targets, and avoid a costly strategic mistake that could have set our European expansion back by months. And Darren remained completely oblivious to what was happening, continuing to see himself as the sophisticated business leader, generously sharing his expertise with his naive wife, who was finally showing some interest in the complex world of corporate strategy. The investigation had revealed something more valuable than I had initially hoped to find. Not only was Darren unaware of my true identity, he was actively providing me with competitive advantages while believing he was simply being a supportive husband. The man who called me someone like Taylor was unknowingly serving as one of my most valuable sources of market intelligence. It was time to start thinking about how to use that advantage more systematically. What started as casual intelligence, gathering soon revealed something far more troubling than I had anticipated. The more Darren shared about his work, the more I realized that his dismissive attitude toward me wasn't just personal. It was part of a broader pattern of how he viewed and treated women in professional settings. The revelation came during a dinner party at Patrick Chen's Lincoln Park townhouse in early April. I had become adept at playing the role of the interested but naive wife, asking questions that seemed curious rather than informed. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, the men became increasingly comfortable discussing their work in front of the wives, assuming we were decorative rather than analytical. The challenge with the Meridian project, Darren was explaining to the group, is that their CEO is a woman, and she's incredibly stubborn about maintaining control over strategic decisions. Patricia Vance thinks she knows better than our consulting team, even though we have decades of combined experience in the energy sector. I nearly choked on my wine. Patricia Vance was one of the most brilliant executives I had ever worked with. Former MIT professor who had built Meridian from a startup into a major player in solar technology. The fact that she was questioning McKinsey's recommendations probably meant she had identified flaws in their analysis, not that she was being unreasonably stubborn. Women executives can be challenging that way, agreed Benedict Torres, swirling his bourbon thoughtfully. They take everything personally instead of looking at the business logic objectively. Exactly, Darren continued, warming to the theme. It's like they feel they have to prove something all the time, so they can't just accept expert advice when it's offered. Vance keeps pushing back on our market expansion strategy, insisting that we don't understand the technical constraints of solar panel manufacturing. I happen to know that Patricia was absolutely correct about those technical constraints, having spent considerable time reviewing the engineering specifications during our due diligence process when we acquired Meridian 2 years earlier. McKinsey's expansion strategy was probably flawed because they didn't understand the manufacturing limitations that Patricia was trying to explain to them. Have you tried going around her? Asked Harry Whitfield. Sometimes with female clients, it's more effective to build relationships with the male executives who can influence the decision-making process. We're working on that, Darren replied, with a knowing smile. Her CFO is much more reasonable to work with. David Chen, no relation to our Patrick here, understands the financial imperatives even if Vance gets hung up on operational details. The casual misogyny was breathtaking, but what was worse was the strategic incompetence it revealed. Patricia Vance was trying to prevent McKinsey from recommending a course of action that would be technically impossible to implement, while Darren and his colleagues were interpreting her expertise as feminine emotionalism. They were literally planning to circumvent the person who best understood the business in order to push through a flawed strategy. As the evening continued, I listened to similar stories about other female clients and colleagues. There was the difficult pharmaceutical CEO who kept questioning their regulatory timeline, probably because she understood FDA approval processes better than they did. There was the overly emotional tech executive who had rejected their product development recommendations, likely because she had better insights into user experience than a bunch of consultants. There was the micromanaging retail director who insisted on reviewing their market research methodology, probably because she had spotted errors in their data collection. What struck me most was how comfortable the men were discussing these attitudes in front of their wives, assuming we would either agree with their assessments or be too polite to challenge them. The wives around the table smiled and nodded, playing their expected roles as supportive audiences for their husbands, professional frustrations. But I was learning something much more valuable than competitive intelligence. I was discovering that Darren's treatment of me wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern of how he and his colleagues approached any woman who threatened their sense of professional superiority. The most disturbing revelation came near the end of the evening when the conversation turned to partnership decisions at McKinsey. The good news about partnership track, Darren was saying, is that it puts you in position to start influencing who gets promoted and who doesn't. There are some really talented people coming up through the ranks, and some others who probably aren't partnership material. Anyone specific you're thinking about? Patrick asked. Well, there's Thea Morrison in our sustainability practice, Darren replied. Brilliant analyst, great with clients, definitely has the technical skills, but I'm not sure she has the leadership presence for partnership. She's a bit too deferential, doesn't command the room the way a partner needs to. I nearly laughed out loud. Thea Morrison was my VP of Strategic Planning at Blackwood Industries, a woman who regularly commanded rooms full of Fortune 500 executives and had never shown even a hint of deference in any professional setting I had witnessed. If she seemed deferential at McKinsey, it was probably because she had learned that assertiveness was interpreted as abrasiveness when it came from women. Leadership presence is so important, agreed Harry. Clients need to see strength and confidence, especially in high-stakes situations. Women often struggle with that because they're naturally more collaborative and consensus-building. The irony was devastating. These men were systematically blocking women from advancement by interpreting their collaborative skills as weakness, then pointing to the lack of female partners as evidence that women weren't naturally suited for leadership roles. As Darren and I walked home that night, I asked carefully crafted questions about the partnership process and his thoughts on colleague development. His answers revealed a worldview that was both internally consistent and completely divorced from reality. He genuinely believed that he was making objective assessments of leadership potential, while actually applying double standards that made it virtually impossible for women to demonstrate the qualities he claimed to value. Take Thea, for example, he said as we crossed Lakeshore Drive. She's incredibly smart, maybe smarter than most of the men in our practice. But when she presents to clients, she asks too many questions instead of just presenting solutions. Clients want consultants who project confidence and authority. I thought about the last board meeting where Thea had presented her analysis of European market opportunities. She had asked exactly the right questions, challenged assumptions that needed to be challenged, and demonstrated the kind of intellectual rigor that had convinced me to promote her ahead of several male colleagues, who were older and more experienced. "Maybe she's just being thorough," I suggested mildly. "Maybe," Darren agreed, "but thoroughness can come across as uncertainty if you're not careful. Women have to be especially conscious of how they present themselves because clients are already inclined to question their expertise." The circular logic was perfect. Women had to work twice as hard to prove their competence, but working hard to prove competence was interpreted as evidence of incompetence. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to how Darren talked about his female colleagues and clients. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Brilliant women were characterized as emotional when they pushed back on flawed recommendations. Experienced executives were described as micromanaging when they insisted on reviewing work product. Successful leaders were dismissed as lucky or in the right place at the right time, rather than talented. Most troubling of all, I realized that this wasn't conscious bias. It was unconscious assumption so deeply embedded that Darren probably would have been genuinely shocked to have it pointed out to him. He saw himself as progressive and supportive of women's advancement, even as he systematically undermined the women around him. And I was beginning to understand that my situation wasn't just about a marriage that had gone wrong. It was about a system that was designed to keep women like me invisible, even when we were hiding in plain sight. By May 2022, I had begun documenting everything systematically. What had started as casual observation had evolved into a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation that would have impressed any corporate investigator. I created encrypted files on my personal laptop, cataloging not just Darren's dismissive comments and professional biases, but building a complete picture of how his worldview was affecting both my marriage and my business interests. The documentation process revealed patterns that were even more troubling than I had initially realized. Darren wasn't just casually sexist. He was strategically undermining women in ways that directly benefited his own career advancement. The more I analyzed his behavior, the more I understood that his treatment of me was part of a calculated approach to professional success that relied on diminishing potential competition. Take the situation with Thea Morrison, for example. After that dinner party conversation, I had quietly investigated her status at McKinsey and discovered something infuriating. Thea had actually been recommended for partnership track by 3 different senior partners, but the recommendation had been blocked during the final review process. According to my sources, and having access to corporate networks across Chicago meant I had excellent sources, the blocking vote had come from Darren and 2 other recently promoted senior principals who had raised questions about her leadership, presence, and client management style. The irony was that Thea was being punished for the same collaborative approach that had made her invaluable to Blackwood Industries. At McKinsey, her tendency to ask probing questions and build consensus was interpreted as weakness. In my company, those same qualities had led to some of our most successful strategic initiatives. I began maintaining detailed records of these professional sabotage incidents, not just for my own understanding, but because I was starting to formulate a plan that would require substantial evidence of systematic bias. Every conversation where Darren dismissed a female colleague's expertise went into the file. Every instance where he attributed a woman's success to luck rather than skill was documented. Every time he suggested going around a female decision-maker to work with male subordinates was carefully recorded. The pattern extended beyond gender bias into something even more personally relevant: intellectual property theft. As Darren continued sharing detailed information about his clients' strategic challenges, I realized that he was essentially providing me with a roadmap for outmaneuvering McKinsey's own recommendations. But more concerning was the discovery that some of the insights he was taking credit for weren't actually his own work. During one of our dinner conversations, Darren described a breakthrough analysis he had developed for a renewable energy client, explaining how he had identified a unique market opportunity that no one else had recognized. The problem was that I recognized the analysis, because it was nearly identical to a strategy brief that Thea Morrison had presented to our board 6 months earlier. Somehow, her intellectual property had been appropriated and repackaged as Darren's original thinking. I started cross-referencing Darren's claimed achievements with information I could gather through my professional networks. The results were disturbing. Several of his most impressive strategic insights appeared to have originated with female colleagues whose contributions had been minimized or erased entirely. His reputation as a rising star was at least partially built on stolen intellectual property from women whose ideas he had systematically appropriated. This discovery led me to expand my documentation beyond personal grievances into potential legal violations. Intellectual property theft within consulting firms was a serious matter, especially when it involved ideas that were later sold to competing clients. If I could prove that Darren was stealing and repurposing his colleagues' work, it would give me leverage that extended far beyond our marriage. The most valuable evidence came from an unexpected source, Darren himself. His habit of mentoring me in business strategy meant that he was constantly sharing detailed information about McKinsey's methodologies, client relationships, and internal decision-making processes. What he saw as helpful education, I was treating as competitive intelligence gathering. I learned about McKinsey's upcoming pitch for a major sustainability consulting contract with the city of Chicago, a contract that Blackwood Industries was also pursuing through our government relations division. Darren's inside information about their pricing strategy, timeline, and key selling points gave me exactly what I needed to structure a superior competing proposal. More importantly, his casual discussion of McKinsey's approach revealed several significant flaws in their understanding of municipal renewable energy procurement. They had misinterpreted key regulations and underestimated the technical complexity of integrating renewable systems with existing city infrastructure. Armed with this knowledge, I was able to craft a proposal that highlighted these exact issues, while positioning Blackwood as the only vendor with the expertise to navigate them successfully. When Blackwood won the contract 3 weeks later, Darren was genuinely puzzled by McKinsey's failure. "I don't understand how we lost that one," he told me over dinner, reviewing the city's feedback letter. "They said our proposal showed fundamental misunderstandings about municipal energy systems, but our team has years of experience in that space. Maybe the other vendor just had better insights into the specific technical requirements," I suggested innocently. "Maybe," Darren agreed. But I could see him struggling to understand how a relatively unknown consulting firm had outmaneuvered one of the world's most prestigious strategy practices. The Chicago contract was worth $12 million to Blackwood Industries, but its strategic value was much higher. It established us as a major player in municipal sustainability consulting and opened doors to similar opportunities across the Midwest. All while Darren continued to see me as someone who needed his guidance to understand basic business concepts. By early June, my files contained enough evidence to destroy both Darren's career and McKinsey's reputation in the Chicago market. I had documented intellectual property theft, systematic gender discrimination, client information misappropriation, and strategic consulting fraud. Any one of these issues could have serious consequences. Together, they represented a pattern of misconduct that would be impossible to dismiss or minimize. But I wasn't ready to deploy this evidence yet. The foundation of my case was solid, but I needed to understand exactly how and when to use it for maximum impact. More importantly, I needed to decide what outcome I actually wanted to achieve. Was this about protecting other women from Darren's systematic undermining? Was it about gaining leverage for my own marriage? Or was it about something larger, using my unique position to expose and address the systemic biases that allowed men like Darren to build careers on the diminishment of women like me? The evidence was compelling, but evidence without strategy was just documentation. It was time to start thinking about how to turn information into action and documentation into justice. The foundation of my case was complete. Now I needed to decide how to build something powerful enough to change not just my own situation, but the entire system that had created it. The transformation from evidence gathering to strategic planning required resources and expertise that went far beyond what I could accomplish alone. In late June, I began carefully assembling a team of allies and advisors who could help me navigate the complex legal, professional, and personal implications of what I was considering. My first call was to Fiona Walsh, the board member who had witnessed Darren's "just a wife" comment at the holiday party. Fiona had built her career as a corporate attorney specializing in employment law and discrimination cases before transitioning into board governance roles. More importantly, she was someone I trusted completely and who understood both my professional capabilities and my personal situation. "I need your advice about something sensitive," I told her during a private lunch at the university club. "It involves potential misconduct at McKinsey that could affect Blackwood's business interests." Fiona listened without interruption as I outlined what I had discovered about Darren's systematic bias against female colleagues, his appropriation of intellectual property, and his sharing of confidential client information. I was careful to present it as a business issue rather than a personal one, focusing on the potential risks to Blackwood's competitive position and reputation. "This is serious," she said when I finished. "If you can prove systematic discrimination and IP theft, it could trigger a federal investigation. McKinsey's contracts with government agencies and publicly traded companies include strict ethics clauses that this would violate." "What would you recommend as next steps?" I asked. "First, we need to bring in someone with specific expertise in corporate fraud and employment discrimination. Second, we need to document everything according to legal standards that would hold up in court. Third, we need to consider whether this is something Blackwood should pursue directly, or whether it requires coordination with other affected parties." Fiona referred me to Kennedy Shaw, a former federal prosecutor who now ran a boutique firm specializing in white-collar crime and corporate misconduct. Kennedy had successfully prosecuted several high-profile cases involving consulting firms and had particular expertise in intellectual property theft within professional services organizations. My meeting with Kennedy the following week was revelatory. She reviewed my documentation with the kind of systematic attention that I recognized from my own business analysis processes, asking probing questions about sources, timelines, and corroborating evidence. "You've done excellent work here," she said after spending 2 hours reviewing my files. "This level of documentation is better than what we usually see from professional investigators. The intellectual property issues alone could result in criminal charges, not just civil liability." "What would be required to pursue this legally?" I asked. "For criminal prosecution, we'd need cooperation from the victims of IP theft, the women whose work was appropriated. For civil action, Blackwood Industries would have strong grounds for a lawsuit based on unfair competition and trade secret misappropriation. The employment discrimination issues would require coordination with current and former McKinsey employees who were affected." Kennedy's analysis revealed something I hadn't fully considered: my unique position as both a victim of Darren's misconduct and a CEO with the resources to address it systematically. Most women who experienced this kind of professional sabotage lacked the power to seek meaningful recourse. But I had the financial resources, legal standing, and business relationships necessary to make pursuing justice both feasible and effective. "There's another dimension to consider," Kennedy continued. "If McKinsey has been systematically discriminating against women and appropriating their intellectual property, you're probably not dealing with isolated incidents. This could be a pattern that affects dozens of current and former employees." This possibility led to my next strategic decision, reaching out directly to some of the women I knew had been affected by similar treatment. I started with Thea Morrison, using my knowledge of her blocked partnership recommendation to open a careful conversation about her experiences at McKinsey. I've been thinking about your insights regarding collaborative leadership styles, I told her during a coffee meeting that I had arranged through a mutual contact. I'm curious about how those approaches are received in different organizational cultures. Thea was initially cautious, but as our conversation progressed, she began sharing details about her experiences that confirmed and expanded my understanding of the systemic issues. The partnership track denial was just the most recent example of a pattern that had been building for years. Her ideas were regularly appropriated without credit. Her expertise was questioned in ways that her male colleagues never was, and her collaborative approach was consistently interpreted as weakness rather than strength. The frustrating thing, she said, is that I know I'm good at what I do. My clients specifically request me for repeat engagements. My project outcomes consistently exceed expectations, and my peer reviews are excellent. But somehow none of that translates into advancement opportunities. More importantly, Thea mentioned several other women at McKinsey who had similar experiences. There's actually an informal network of us who share information and support each other, she said. We've talked about whether there might be grounds for some kind of formal complaint, but most people are afraid of retaliation. This was exactly the opening I needed. What if you had institutional support for pursuing those concerns? I asked carefully. Hypothetically, if there were legal resources available and protection from retaliation. Thea's eyes sharpened with interest. That would change everything. But who would provide that kind of support? Let me think about that and get back to you, I said, already knowing exactly who would provide it. Over the following weeks, I had similar conversations with 4 other women who had been affected by what was clearly a systematic pattern of discrimination and intellectual property theft at McKinsey. Each conversation added new details to the picture, while also revealing potential allies who could provide testimony and evidence that would make any legal action much stronger. Meanwhile, I was also assembling the financial and strategic resources necessary to pursue this comprehensively. Through my role at Blackwood Industries, I had access to some of the best legal talent in the country, along with the financial resources to fund a major litigation effort. More importantly, I had business relationships that could provide additional pressure points if McKinsey attempted to minimize or dismiss the allegations. Several of our major clients and partners also worked with McKinsey, giving Blackwood significant leverage in any negotiation or settlement discussion. If we could demonstrate that McKinsey's misconduct had affected the quality of their consulting services, those client relationships could become powerful allies in seeking accountability. By the end of July, I had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive legal and strategic team capable of taking on one of the world's most powerful consulting firms. Kennedy Shaw would lead the legal strategy, Fiona Walsh would provide corporate governance expertise, and I had identified 6 women willing to provide testimony about systematic discrimination and intellectual property theft. Most importantly, I had gained clarity about my objectives. This wasn't just about personal vindication or even professional justice. It was about using my unique position and resources to address a systemic problem that affected countless women in professional services firms across the country. The case I was building had the potential to create precedent-setting legal accountability for workplace discrimination and intellectual property theft. But first, I needed to decide how and when to confront Darren directly about what I had discovered. The resources were assembled. The strategy was clear. Now it was time to decide how to deploy them for maximum impact. August 2022 became the month of perfect performance. While I assembled my legal team and built my case against McKinsey, I simultaneously had to maintain the fiction of being Darren's supportive, naive wife, who was slowly learning about business strategy under his patient guidance. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it was also oddly empowering, like being an undercover agent in my own life. Every morning, I would wake up and consciously decide which version of myself to present. Over breakfast, I was Taylor the grateful wife, listening attentively as Darren explained some basic business concept that I had actually mastered years before he ever heard of it. "That's so interesting," I would say when he described market segmentation strategies, while internally calculating how those same principles applied to Blackwood's upcoming expansion into Southeast Asia. "You're really getting the hang of this business thinking," Darren told me one morning as he prepared for work, straightening his tie with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he was molding an eager student. "I think your consulting practice could really benefit from some of the frameworks I've been teaching you." "I hope so," I replied with appropriate humility. "I have so much to learn still." What he didn't know was that 30 minutes after he left for the office, I would be on a video call with executives from our German subsidiary, discussing the integration challenges of our recent battery technology acquisition. The woman who needed his guidance on basic business concepts was simultaneously managing a deal worth more than his entire annual salary. The evening routine was equally surreal. Darren would come home energized from his day, eager to share his professional victories and strategic insights with his appreciative audience of one. I learned to ask exactly the right questions, ones that seemed curious rather than informed, supportive rather than challenging. "How did the Meridian presentation go?" I would ask, already knowing from my sources that it had been a disaster, because McKinsey still hadn't grasped the technical constraints that Patricia Vance had been trying to explain for months. "Not as well as expected," Darren would admit. "Vance is still being stubborn about the expansion timeline. She keeps insisting that we don't understand the manufacturing limitations, but I think she's just making excuses because she's afraid of rapid growth." I would nod sympathetically while knowing that Patricia was absolutely correct, and that McKinsey's recommendations would have resulted in production commitments that were physically impossible to meet. "Maybe she's just being cautious," I would suggest mildly. "That's the problem with female executives," Darren would reply. "They're so risk-averse that they miss obvious opportunities for growth." These conversations had become a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Darren wasn't just dismissing my intelligence. He was using our intimate relationship to validate his own biases about women in leadership roles. Every evening, I provided him with a safe space to express attitudes that would have been professionally disastrous if voiced in his workplace, while he remained completely unaware that his most trusted confidant was one of the female executives he was systematically undermining. The most challenging aspect wasn't the deception itself. It was maintaining emotional equilibrium while listening to my husband reveal himself to be someone fundamentally different from the man I had married. The Darren who had fallen in love with my intelligence at Northwestern had been replaced by someone who needed me to be smaller so that he could feel larger. But the double life also provided unexpected advantages. My performance as the naive wife had become so convincing that Darren had completely lowered his guard about sharing confidential information. He would discuss McKinsey's internal politics, upcoming partnership decisions, and strategic client discussions with the casual openness of someone who believed his audience couldn't possibly understand the implications. "Patrick thinks he's going to get the sustainability practice leadership role," Darren mentioned one evening while we prepared dinner together. "But I've been positioning myself with the right clients and board members. Leadership wants someone who can think strategically about practice development, not just execute existing projects." What he was describing was essentially a campaign to undermine his colleague through relationship manipulation and strategic information control. Exactly the kind of behavior that would have appalled the man I had married, but which current Darren seemed to view as normal professional advancement. Meanwhile, I was using the intelligence he provided to stay several steps ahead of McKinsey's strategic moves. When Darren mentioned that they were planning to pitch a sustainability consulting contract to the state of Illinois, I had Blackwood's government relations team submit our proposal 2 weeks earlier with more comprehensive technical specifications and more competitive pricing. When he shared details about their upcoming partnership discussions with a renewable energy startup in California, I had our venture capital arm initiate acquisition talks with the same company. leveraging our superior financial resources and strategic position to present a more attractive offer. By the end of August, I had used information gained through Pillow Talk to outmaneuver McKinsey on 4 separate business opportunities, while maintaining the perfect facade of a supportive wife who was gradually learning to appreciate the complexities of corporate strategy. The double life was becoming easier with practice, but it was also revealing truths about my marriage that I wasn't sure I could continue to live with much longer. September marked the beginning of what I privately called Phase 2, the systematic positioning of pieces for the eventual confrontation. Everything I had learned about Darren's professional vulnerabilities and McKinsey's institutional weaknesses needed to be transformed into leverage that could create lasting change rather than just temporary satisfaction. The first major move came through an unexpected opportunity. Blackwood Industries had been invited to participate in a joint venture with 3 other major corporations to develop a new renewable energy research facility in downtown Chicago. The project would require significant consulting support for regulatory compliance, technology integration, and strategic planning, exactly the kind of high-profile engagement that McKinsey would desperately want to win. But here's what made it perfect. The project would be housed in the Blackwood Building, our flagship office tower that also happened to be where McKinsey's Chicago office was located. As the primary sponsor of the research facility, Blackwood would have significant influence over vendor selection and project management. In other words, I would be in a position to determine whether McKinsey got the contract, and under what terms. I began laying the groundwork carefully, working with our procurement team to develop selection criteria that would favor firms with demonstrated expertise in collaborative leadership and inclusive team management. On paper, these seemed like standard corporate social responsibility requirements. In practice, they were designed to expose exactly the kind of systematic bias that I had documented in McKinsey's approach to female professionals. We're emphasizing thought leadership and innovative problem-solving approaches, I explained to our board when presenting the vendor selection framework. We want consulting partners who can demonstrate not just technical expertise, but cultural alignment with our values of inclusivity and collaborative excellence. Fiona Walsh, who was part of the board discussion, caught the subtext immediately. Those criteria seem very appropriate for a project of this magnitude, she said with barely concealed approval, particularly given the public visibility and potential for establishing new industry standards. Meanwhile, I was also positioning the timing to coincide with Blackwood's annual holiday party in December, the same event where Darren had made his dismissive "just a wife" comment the previous year. The symmetry was too perfect to ignore. If everything went according to plan, the consulting vendor selection would be announced at that party, creating an opportunity for a very public demonstration of exactly who held the real power in our relationship. But the consulting contract was just one element of a larger strategic framework. Through Kennedy Shaw's investigation, we had identified 12 current and former McKinsey employees who had experienced systematic discrimination or intellectual property theft. 6 of them were willing to provide formal testimony, and 3 had documentation that corroborated my own evidence about Darren's misconduct. More importantly, Kennedy had discovered that several of McKinsey's major clients had begun questioning the quality and originality of their strategic recommendations. The pattern of appropriated intellectual property had resulted in consulting solutions that were recycled, outdated, or technically flawed. Exactly the kind of service quality issues that could trigger contract reviews and potential litigation. We're not just building a case against individual bad actors, Kennedy explained during one of our strategy sessions. We're documenting systemic institutional failures that affect McKinsey's core business relationships. That gives us leverage that goes far beyond any single employment dispute. The most elegant aspect of the positioning was how it turned Darren's own behavior against him. His habit of sharing confidential client information with his naive wife had provided me with detailed knowledge of McKinsey's strategic vulnerabilities. His systematic undermining of female colleagues had created a network of potential allies who were eager to see accountability established. His appropriation of intellectual property had generated a paper trail that could trigger both civil and criminal liability. In essence, Darren had spent months providing me with the exact tools I needed to destroy his career and expose the institutional culture that had enabled his behavior. But I wasn't interested in simple destruction. The goal was to create systemic change that would protect other women from experiencing what I had endured, while also demonstrating that dismissing capable people based on gender stereotypes was not just morally wrong, but strategically stupid. By late September, all the pieces were in position. The legal framework was solid, the business leverage was significant, and the timing was perfect. The consulting contract announcement would create the ideal public setting for revealing the truth about my identity and Darren's misconduct. Most importantly, I had finally decided what outcome I wanted to achieve. This wasn't about saving my marriage. That relationship was already over, killed by Darren's systematic erosion of respect and partnership. This was about using my unique position and resources to create accountability that would extend far beyond my personal situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform not just my own life, but potentially the entire culture of one of the world's most influential consulting firms. All that remained was to execute the plan with the same precision and strategic thinking that had made me successful in every other aspect of my professional life. The first week of December felt like the calm before a perfectly orchestrated storm. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered, every piece of evidence organized and verified. All that remained was the execution of a strategy that would transform months of careful preparation into a single moment of absolute clarity. Kennedy Shaw had filed all the necessary legal documents, sealed and ready for immediate deployment. The discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was complete, supported by testimony from 7 McKinsey employees and dozens of documented incidents. The intellectual property theft allegations were backed by forensic analysis that could prove systematic appropriation of female colleagues' work. The breach of confidentiality claims were supported by recorded conversations and documented instances of client information sharing. "Everything is ready," Kennedy assured me during our final strategy meeting. "The moment you give the signal, we can move on multiple fronts simultaneously. The legal filings will be submitted, the press materials will be distributed, and the client notifications will be sent. McKinsey will be dealing with a crisis on at least 4 different fronts before they have time to develop a coherent response." But the legal strategy was only part of the plan. The business implications were equally significant and carefully coordinated. The renewable energy research facility vendor selection had been completed, with results that would be announced at Blackwood's holiday party on December 15th. McKinsey had submitted a proposal, just as I had anticipated, but it would not be the winning bid. Instead, the contract would go to Morrison Strategic Partners, a new consulting firm founded by Thea. Morrison and 3 other former McKinsey employees who had experienced similar discrimination. I had personally provided the initial funding for their startup through Blackwood's venture capital arm, creating a pathway for talented women to build careers outside the toxic environment they had escaped. "The irony is beautiful," Fiona Walsh observed as we reviewed the final arrangements. "Darren has been sharing McKinsey's strategic information with the wife of the CEO, who is about to demonstrate that their approach to talent management is not just morally bankrupt, but strategically inferior." The personal preparations were equally meticulous. I had moved my most important belongings out of our shared condo gradually over the past month, transferring them to a penthouse apartment in the Blackwood building that Darren didn't know existed. My financial assets had been separated and secured. My legal standing as CEO had been reinforced with new board resolutions, and my personal safety had been ensured through discreet security arrangements. Most importantly, I had mentally and emotionally prepared for the end of my marriage to someone who had never really known who I was. The man I had fallen in love with at Northwestern no longer existed, if he ever had. In his place was someone whose career success depended on diminishing the women around him, someone who could share intimate evenings with his wife while systematically undermining everything she represented professionally. The final preparation was perhaps the most symbolic. Selecting what to wear to the holiday party, I chose a midnight blue dress that was elegant but commanding, expensive but understated, the kind of outfit that projected authority without apology. It was the same dress I had worn to my first board meeting as CEO, when I had officially taken control of my grandfather's legacy. "You look like someone who owns the building," my assistant Faye commented when she saw me in the office that morning, not knowing how literally accurate her observation was. The guest list for the party had been carefully curated. All the major McKinsey partners would be there, including the ones who had enabled Darren's rise through the ranks. Several business journalists had been invited, along with executives from companies that relied on McKinsey's consulting services. The board members of 3 organizations that were considering major consulting contracts would be in attendance, positioned to witness firsthand how McKinsey's leadership responded to evidence of systematic misconduct. As December 15th dawned, clear and cold, I felt the kind of crystalline focus that had always marked my most important professional moments. Every variable had been accounted for, every outcome had been anticipated, every detail had been perfected. Darren left for work that morning in an exceptionally good mood, excited about the evening's party and confident about his prospects for the partnership announcement that he expected would come early in the new year. He had no idea that his wife had spent months building a case that would not only end his career, but potentially transform the entire culture of professional services. Firms across the country, "See you tonight, babe," he said, kissing me goodbye with the casual affection of someone who had never questioned the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. This is going to be a great party. He was absolutely right. It was going to be unforgettable. The Zai. Blackwood Industries' holiday party began exactly as I had orchestrated it. The 42nd floor conference room had been transformed into an elegant venue, with Chicago's skyline providing a dramatic backdrop through floor-to-ceiling windows. 200 guests mingled among the holiday decorations, completely unaware that they were about to witness the most significant corporate confrontation in the city's recent history. I arrived fashionably late, making my entrance as Taylor Blackwood-Mitchell, the supportive wife attending her husband's company function. Darren spotted me immediately and approached with his characteristic confident smile, clearly pleased to show off his elegant spouse to his colleagues and clients. "You look stunning," he said, taking my arm possessively as he guided me toward his group of McKinsey partners. "I want you to meet some of the senior leadership team. For the first hour, I played my role perfectly." I smiled graciously as Darren introduced me to people I had actually been doing business with for years, nodded appreciatively as they explained basic business concepts to me, and asked naive questions about their work while internally cataloging every condescending comment and dismissive gesture. "Taylor's been learning so much about corporate strategy," Darren announced to a group that included Patrick Chen and Benedict Torres. "I've been mentoring her in some of the frameworks we use at McKinsey. She's actually quite insightful for someone without formal business training." The casual erasure of my MBA from Northwestern and my years of CEO experience was delivered with such unconscious arrogance that several guests shifted uncomfortably. But I simply smiled and thanked him for his patient teaching, while mentally noting that we now had witnesses to his systematic pattern of diminishing my qualifications. The first phase of the confrontation began when Fiona Walsh approached our group, carrying the sealed envelope that contained the vendor selection results for the renewable energy research facility. As planned, she had been designated to make the announcement during the evening's formal presentation. "Excuse me, everyone," she said with professional authority. "I need to borrow Mrs. Mitchell for a moment. We're ready to announce the consulting contract award, and as the project sponsor, she should be involved in the presentation." The confusion on Darren's face was immediate and obvious. "Project sponsor?" he repeated, clearly struggling to understand why his wife would have any role in a major business announcement. "Of course," Fiona continued smoothly. "As CEO of Blackwood Industries, Mrs. Mitchell has been leading the vendor selection process for our new research facility." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the information processed through Darren's mind. His wife, the woman he had been condescendingly mentoring in basic business concepts, was actually the CEO of one of Chicago's largest privately held corporations. "I'm sorry," Patrick Chen said carefully. "Did you say CEO?" "That's right," I replied, speaking publicly in my professional capacity for the first time in front of my husband. "I'm Taylor Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Industries. Though most of you probably know me better as Darren's wife who serves the coffee and doesn't understand complex business strategy." The color drained from Darren's face as the implications began to sink in. Around us, conversations had stopped, as people strained to understand what was happening. Several McKinsey partners exchanged glances of growing alarm as they realized the woman they had been dismissing all evening was actually one of their most important potential clients. "This is impossible," Darren whispered, but his voice carried in the suddenly quiet room. "You're a freelance consultant. You work on small projects. I'm the person who has been awarding or denying McKinsey consulting contracts worth tens of millions of dollars," I said calmly. "I'm also the person who has been documenting systematic discrimination, intellectual property theft, and breach of client confidentiality within your organization for the past 8 months. Benedict Torres stepped forward, his legal training clearly kicking in. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think there may be some misunderstanding." "It's Ms. Blackwood," I corrected. "And there's no misunderstanding. Kennedy Shaw, please join us." Kennedy appeared at my side as if summoned, carrying a briefcase that everyone in the room could identify as the kind that contained serious legal documents. "Good evening," she said to the group. "I'm Kennedy Shaw, representing Ms. Blackwood, and 6 current and former McKinsey employees in matters related to employment discrimination and intellectual property theft." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. What had started as a holiday party was becoming a very public legal confrontation with some of Chicago's most influential business leaders as witnesses. Darren looked like he was going to be sick. "Taylor, what are you doing? Why are you—" "I'm doing what I should have done months ago," I replied. "I'm refusing to make myself smaller so that you can feel larger. And I'm using the resources and authority that you never bothered to discover. I had to ensure that other women don't have to endure what you put me through." The first phase of the confrontation was complete. Now came the moment when months of careful preparation would transform into immediate consequences that would reshape multiple careers and potentially an entire industry. The formal presentation began with Kennedy Shaw opening her briefcase and distributing folders to each of the McKinsey partners present. The room had transformed from a holiday celebration into something resembling a corporate tribunal, with guests clustering around the central confrontation while maintaining respectful distance. "What you're receiving," Kennedy announced to the group, "is a comprehensive documentation of systematic discrimination, intellectual property theft, and breach of client confidentiality within McKinsey's Chicago office. The evidence spans 18 months and involves multiple clients, employees, and senior partners." Patrick Chen opened his folder first, his face growing increasingly pale as he scanned the contents. "These are confidential personnel discussions," he said weakly. "How did you—" "Mr. Mitchell provided detailed information about McKinsey's internal operations, client strategies, and personnel decisions during what he believed were private conversations with his naive wife," I replied. "Every dismissive comment about female colleagues, every instance of appropriated intellectual property, and every breach of client confidentiality has been documented and verified." Darren's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. The woman he had been condescendingly mentoring in business strategy had been using his casual sexism and professional arrogance to build a comprehensive case against his employer. The Thea Morrison partnership decision, I continued, addressing Patrick directly, was blocked based on gender bias that violated both McKinsey's stated diversity policies and federal employment law. Mr. Mitchell's characterization of her lack of leadership presence was contradicted by client feedback that specifically praised her collaborative approach and strategic insights. Benedict Torres was frantically flipping through his folder, clearly looking for his own name in the documentation. "This is entrapment," he said desperately. "You can't use private conversations between spouses." "Actually, we can," Kennedy interrupted smoothly. "Particularly when those conversations involve confession of criminal activity. Intellectual property theft, conspiracy to defraud clients, and systematic employment discrimination are not protected by spousal privilege." I turned to address the larger crowd, many of whom were potential McKinsey clients who had been invited specifically to witness this moment. Over the past year, McKinsey has consistently recommended strategies that were technically impossible to implement, financially unsound, or based on stolen intellectual property. The renewable energy sector analysis that they've been selling to multiple clients was originally developed by Thea Morrison, whose contributions were systematically erased and repackaged as original McKinsey methodology. The business implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If McKinsey had been selling recycled or stolen strategies to competing clients, it represented massive liability and potential fraud that could trigger contract cancellations and litigation across their entire practice. "The vendor selection announcement," Fiona Walsh said, stepping forward with perfect timing, "reflects Blackwood Industries' commitment to working with consulting partners who demonstrate both technical excellence and ethical leadership. The Renewable Energy Research Facility contract has been awarded to Morrison Strategic Partners, founded by former McKinsey employees who left due to the discriminatory practices documented in these files. The symbolism was devastating. The women McKinsey had systematically undermined were now being rewarded with the contracts that McKinsey had expected to win." Harry Whitfield finally found his voice. "This is a coordinated attack on our firm's reputation based on isolated incidents taken out of context." "Isolated incidents," I repeated, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "Mr. Mitchell shared confidential information about 17 different client engagements over the past 8 months. He described systematic efforts to circumvent female decision-makers at client companies. He detailed strategies for appropriating intellectual property from female colleagues and presenting it as original work. None of this was isolated, and all of it was voluntary." Darren had been silent throughout the presentation, but now he stepped forward with something approaching desperation. "Taylor, you're my wife. You can't. This isn't. We need to talk about this privately." "Ex-wife, actually," I replied, producing the divorce papers that had been finalized that morning. The marriage ended when I realized that the man I loved had been replaced by someone who needed to diminish women to feel successful. And there's nothing private about systematic discrimination that affects dozens of employees and millions of dollars in client relationships. The final revelation came when I addressed the gathered crowd directly, speaking as CEO rather than as a betrayed spouse. Blackwood Industries will be conducting a comprehensive review of all consulting relationships to ensure alignment with our values of merit-based advancement and collaborative leadership. We encourage other organizations to examine whether their consulting partners demonstrate the same commitment to ethical practices and inclusive excellence. The message was unmistakable. McKinsey's behavior had consequences that extended far beyond individual careers to potentially massive financial and reputational damage across their entire client base. The confrontation was complete. What remained was to see how quickly and how far the consequences would spread. The silence that followed my announcement lasted exactly 12 seconds. I counted them. Then the room erupted into controlled chaos as the implications began cascading through the crowd of witnesses. Cell phones appeared as business journalists captured the story that would dominate Chicago's financial news for weeks. McKinsey partners huddled in urgent, whispered conversations, while their potential clients discreetly moved away from any association with the unfolding scandal. Patrick Chen was the first to attempt damage control. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate Ms. Blackwood's concerns and look forward to addressing them through appropriate channels. However, this is hardly the venue for—" "This is exactly the venue," I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority that came from owning the building we were standing in. "These are the same people who have been receiving flawed strategic advice based on stolen intellectual property and compromised by systematic bias. They deserve to understand why McKinsey's recommendations have been consistently inferior to those provided by firms that actually value diverse perspectives." Kennedy Shaw stepped forward with practiced precision. "McKinsey Chicago will be receiving formal legal notices within 48 hours. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaint has been filed, supported by testimony from 7 current and former employees. The intellectual property theft allegations include forensic analysis that traces stolen work product through multiple client engagements." Darren finally seemed to grasp the enormity of what was happening. "You've destroyed my career," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've worked for." "You destroyed your own career," I replied without sympathy. "I simply documented it. Every dismissive comment, every stolen idea, every breach of confidentiality was your choice. I just refused to remain silent about it." The crowd began to thin as guests recognized that they were witnessing a corporate meltdown that would have serious legal and financial consequences. Several McKinsey clients approached Fiona Walsh to request private meetings about reviewing their consulting relationships. 3 business journalists had already left, clearly rushing to file stories about the evening's revelations. Benedict Torres made one final attempt at intimidation. "This will backfire on you, Ms. Blackwood. McKinsey has resources and relationships." That what?" I asked calmly. "That will somehow undo months of documented evidence? That will convince courts to ignore systematic discrimination? That will restore client confidence after they learn their strategic advice was based on stolen intellectual property?" Security appeared at my gesture, not to escort anyone out, but to ensure that the McKinsey partners couldn't approach any of the potential witnesses who were still present. The message was clear. This building, this event, and this revelation were all under my control. As the McKinsey group finally departed, their confident demeanor replaced by barely concealed panic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being completely authentic in every aspect of my life. No more pretending to be less intelligent, less capable, or less powerful than I actually was. The woman who had poured coffee while being called just a wife was gone forever, replaced by someone who would never again accept being diminished for someone else's comfort. The immediate aftermath was complete, but I knew the real consequences were just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where everything had changed, but now it hosted the quarterly board meeting of Morrison Strategic Partners. Thea Morrison was presenting their expansion plans to a room full of investors, including executives from companies that had terminated their McKinsey contracts after the discrimination scandal broke. "Our collaborative leadership approach has resulted in client satisfaction scores that exceed industry averages by 30%, Thea reported with the confidence of someone whose expertise was finally being recognized and valued. "We've secured 12 major contracts, including 3 that were previously held by McKinsey Chicago. The ripple effects had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. McKinsey's Chicago office had lost 18 major clients and faced ongoing federal investigation for employment discrimination. Patrick Chen had resigned under pressure. Benedict Torres was facing personal liability for intellectual property theft, and Harry Whitfield had been demoted to junior consultant. The firm's reputation for ethical leadership had been permanently damaged, forcing a comprehensive review of their practices nationwide. Darren had been terminated within a week of the holiday party, his partnership track eliminated along with his career prospects at any major consulting firm. The last I heard, he was working for a small business advisory practice in Milwaukee, considerably humbled by the experience of having his professional standing determined by someone he had systematically underestimated. More importantly, the case had established legal precedent for addressing systematic workplace discrimination and intellectual property theft. 3 other major consulting firms had proactively revised their promotion processes and bias training programs, rather than face similar exposure. As for me, I had finally integrated all aspects of my identity into something authentic and powerful. The CEO who commanded boardrooms was the same person who navigated personal relationships. The strategic thinking that built billion-dollar corporations was applied to every decision in my life. Standing at the window overlooking Chicago's skyline, I reflected on how completely my world had transformed. The woman who had allowed herself to be called just a wife had evolved into someone who would never again accept anything less than full recognition of her worth. The foundation that had crumbled under the weight of systematic diminishment had been rebuilt into something unshakable, the absolute certainty that I deserved to take up every inch of space I had earned. Some lessons come at a steep price, but as it turned out, I was very good at collecting what was owed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.